Well, this morning we're gonna be in Matthew 19. So before we hit Matthew chapter 19, pray with me. God, here we are. Here because we want to know you more. Here because we love you. We've set time aside in our schedule. We've become unbusy for you because you're important. Because your life, because we need to hear from you, because our lives depend upon it. And so, Jesus, as we read the words that you spoke long ago that Matthew recorded for us, help us to understand what it is you want us to know. Jesus, speak to us. Open our hearts and our minds, our ears. Cause us to respond to you as you have asked us to. And that might look different for each person. So in relationship with each one of us, God, speak. I ask it and I pray it in your name. Amen. Well, we were playing around with the cameras a little bit before the service. So this is for you, Quentin. Quentin, all right, just wanted to make sure you're awake, Quentin. Okay, did that come through okay? All right. I'm gonna hear about that after. Well, let's turn to Matthew chapter 19. Matthew chapter 19. Last week, I said that we're going to look at a hard passage. Last week was a difficult passage. Last week's passage was about helping, as fellow disciples, helping other disciples out of habits or lifestyle of sin, and how we need to approach them and help them and pray for them and to confront them and forgive them. And that was a hard passage. And really, these passages are hard because Jesus is speaking things that are countercultural. Jesus is inaugurating a kingdom of heaven that is unlike any other kingdom, certainly unlike any other human kingdom. Now, there is no kingdom like the kingdom of heaven. And so when Jesus speaks these hard words, they're hard to us because they're countercultural. We say, well, what's that all about? That's not the way I thought about it. That's not the way I would do it. That's not the way the world does it. And Jesus knows that, and that's kind of the point. Because the kingdom of heaven is different than any other kingdom. And so in Matthew 19, we come to some even more difficult words. Last week was hard, but this is harder. This is going to be more difficult. So let's move into it, because what we're talking about is marriage and divorce. Chapter 19. We'll read the first 12 verses. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and will be united as one and will become united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate.'" "Why then," the Pharisees asked, "did Moses command that the man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." The disciples said to him, "If this is the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry." Jesus replied, "Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who are born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it." Difficult words, tough words, hard things to understand what Jesus is saying. And so there they are, traveling to Jerusalem. We are under a month now. Under a month before Jesus is going to be hanging on that cross and dying for the sins of the world. They are coming from the north. I think we have a map up on the screen. We don't have a map. That's okay. But Jesus is coming from the north, and he is going down south to Jerusalem. There were two ways to get to Jerusalem from the Sea of Galilee. You could go through Samaria. Samaria was on the one side of the Jordan River, and you could go through Samaria, or you could cross the Jordan River and go through the land of Decapolis, Perea, which was called the eastern part of Judea. Most people most people crossed the Jordan and went around that way because the Israelites did not go through Samaria. They avoided Samaria as much as they could. They felt that going through Samaria would make them unclean. They considered the Samaritans unclean. And especially if you're going to go to the Passover festival, you didn't want to go through Samaria. And there were a lot of hostilities between the Samaritans and the Jews. So Jesus and his disciples, they go around, they cross the Jordan, and they go through the land of Perea. It's interesting, by the way, we're going to see in chapter 20 that Jesus crosses the Jordan and he goes to Jericho. I say that's interesting because remember, Matthew is writing and he's really showing that Jesus is in many ways the new Moses. He's the new, he's the Messiah who leads people out of bondage into freedom. And we saw before, I don't want to make too much of this, we'll talk about it in chapter 20, but we saw before that, Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, which was like Moses going up on the mountain. Jesus went into the wilderness. It was like the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. Well, Jesus crossing over into the Jordan, crossing the Jordan and into Jericho, that was where the Israelites first crossed into the land of Canaan. And the first city they ever came against and God gave them was Jericho. And that was a sign that God would give them the promised land, that he was bringing them out of bondage. He was going to rescue them from all of their enemies, and they would enjoy peace and freedom in the promised land. In some senses, Matthew is using this crossing over the Jordan, going to Jericho, as Jesus bringing us out of bondage of sin. He's going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to destroy Satan. He's going to destroy sin and give us salvation and freedom from bondage. So that's kind of the picture that's going on there. And so they're in the land of Perea, the other side of the Jordan, the region of Judea, and large crowds followed him. Again, we see that large crowds follow Jesus. Again, Matthew is setting this up for us. He has been with his disciples mostly in private for about 6 months. He nears Jerusalem again. The crowds see him and say, "Hey, he's back, here's Jesus." And they begin to bring all of these people who need healing. And they bring all of these people that are who knows, they have all sorts of skin diseases. They're paralytics. They have whatever it is they have. They can't walk. They're blind. They're lame. They're mute. They're deaf. And they're bringing these people to Jesus. And he's healing them there. And of course, where all the crowds are, and of course where Jesus is doing his works, we have the Pharisees. And the Pharisees show up. And they came to him to test him. What a crazy contrast. Large crowds followed Jesus and he healed them there. And Matthew contrasts that with the Pharisees. The Pharisees come and they aren't excited, they aren't thankful, they aren't recognizing and acknowledging the healings and acknowledging how Jesus is bringing about the kingdom of heaven here on earth. They don't acknowledge any of that. They come not to say, "Jesus, we need help, we need salvation, we need healing." They come to say, "Jesus, we want to test you." They want to try to destroy Jesus. They want to trip him up. They want to cause him to stumble. And remember, the word "cause to stumble" means to set a trap for him in order to catch him and kill him. That's what they want to do. And they ask him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? This topic of divorce has always been contentious. Even in amongst the Pharisees, amongst the rulers of the Jews, amongst the rabbis, nobody has been able to really come to any unanimity about marriage and divorce. So it's always been contentious. And these Pharisees want to draw Jesus into the legalities of divorce. So Jesus, what is it? What makes it okay to divorce? What are the grounds for the divorce? Is it for any and every reason? There were two major schools of thought on marriage and divorce in those times. One was the school of Shammai. Shammai was a rabbi, one of the leading rabbis, and his school of thought said there's only one reason you can get divorced. The legality about getting divorced is if there's sexual immorality, then you're free to divorce. But there was then also the school of Hillel. Hillel was another leading rabbi, and the school of Hillel said, well, no, it's broader than that. The school of Hillel really said there's a whole lot of reasons for divorce. You can rightly be divorced if your wife spoils the food that she's making for dinner, if she burns the toast, if she overbakes the bread, if the cookies are hard and not soft, if the steak is well done and you wanted it medium rare. If your dinner is spoiled, you could divorce your wife because she didn't please you. If she wore her hair down outside in public, you could divorce her. Because some of what was happening was if you wore your hair down, it was sometimes a sign that you were a prostitute. So if your wife wore her hair down, then you could divorce her. If your wife spoke to another man or other men in the marketplace for what you considered would be too long of a time, well, then you could divorce her. If your wife spoke disrespectfully about her husband's parents when the husband was in the room to hear it, he could divorce her. If a wife was arguing with her husband and her voice was heard outside of the house arguing with her husband, then the school of Hillel said you could divorce her. See, the school of Hillel said really for any and every reason you could divorce your wife. Another Rabbi Akiba said, if whatever your wife does that displeases you is grounds for divorce. So into this debate, into this legality of divorce, the Pharisees tried to draw Jesus. Now you need to know some other background about divorce in this Jewish society. Only the man could divorce his wife. A woman could not divorce her husband. She was not able to initiate that. Only the man could initiate divorce. And for a woman to be divorced, she could be divorced without her consent. It wouldn't take anything. All a man would have to say is repeat, I divorce you 3 times, and she would be divorced. But a woman could not divorce her husband without her husband's consent. Now you're saying, wait a minute, you just told me women could not initiate divorce. Well, there were certain extreme circumstances in which a woman could divorce her husband in those days. One was if her husband contracted an infectious disease or a fatal disease, such as leprosy. If her husband contracted leprosy, she could force her husband's consent to be divorced. If her husband tried to force her to leave the promised land, to leave Israel and move out of country, a woman could force her husband's consent for divorce. And here's a weird one. If her husband was a tanner, she could force his hand to be divorced because in the process of tanning, he would need to collect dog dung. And so if your husband was collecting dung from dogs and other animals for the process of tanning, that was significant enough that was one of the legalities by which a woman could initiate divorce. And so you've got all of this crazy, what's legal, what can I do, what can I get away with, what's okay, under what circumstance. And they're trying to define the legalities of divorce. And they want to pull Jesus into it. And they want Jesus to be a lawyer. They want Jesus to be the judge. They want Jesus to enter into this legal debate with them. Oh, and by the way, there was one condition of divorce that may or may not have saved some marriages, if I could put it that way. If you divorced your wife, you were to return her dowry. Unless, of course, there was some heinous thing in your wife, then you didn't have to. But normally you would have to return her dowry. So if your wife came with a large dowry, you would have to make sure you had enough money to divorce your wife, kind of thing, to give her dowry back. So there was that in place to give at least some sort of pause before you just up and divorced your wife because she burnt your toast. And so into this debate. I mean, aren't those crazy? Those are, like, where do those even come from? They're just man-made legalities that we try to make ourselves feel better about. And into this, they want to draw Jesus. But Jesus doesn't get drawn into the legality of it because Jesus did not come for the law. Jesus did not come to define the law. Jesus did not come to create the law. Jesus did not come for law. What did he come for? Relationship. Jesus fulfilled the law through relationship. Remember, we talked about that earlier. Jesus said, I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. How did he fulfill the law? He fulfilled it in relationship to God the Father because he obeyed him by dying on the cross. When he was asked one of the two greatest laws, he didn't repeat laws, he repeated relationship. He said, love God and love others. To fulfill the law, you live in relationship. It's relationships that fulfill the law, not more laws. And the debate is never about law. And so Jesus brings it back to relationship. And remember, in this section, Jesus is talking about relationship. He's saying to his disciples, look, the kingdom of heaven is unlike any other kingdom. And if you're going to be my disciple, here's what it looks like to be in relationship with others. Here's how you treat others. Here's how you interact with others. Here's how you deal with others. And here's how you deal with marriage. Here, as disciples of Christ, is what it looks like to be in the most intimate relationship. And so he brings it around to relationships. He says, haven't you read? At the beginning, the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Jesus takes it back to creation. He takes it back to the very beginning. Let me take you back there. Genesis 1:27. Genesis 1. Verse 27 says, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. So he brings them back to the very beginning of God made man and woman, and he gave them a purpose, and he made them for each other. And then Genesis 2, 20, I'm going to read the second half of 20 and go to 24. Genesis chapter 2, 20b, if you like, the second half. But for Adam no suitable helper was found. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to man. Then the man brought her to the man. The man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, and for she was taken out of man. And verse 24, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. This is what Jesus is talking about. Jesus brings it all back to creation, back to relationship. Jesus isn't going to get involved in this legalese stuff because it's all about relationship. And notice that Jesus brings it to marriage. Jesus isn't going to discuss the legalities of divorce. He is going to say, let's talk about marriage. Let's talk about the relationship marriage. In most Bibles, at the top of chapter 19, you probably have the heading that says divorce. This is not about divorce as much as it is about marriage. The heading's wrong. It should really say marriage because Jesus brings it back to marriage. Jesus does not debate divorce. He doesn't debate the legalities of it. What he does is say, look, you guys have it wrong. You guys want to know what's okay. You guys want to know how far away from God can you get and still be okay. Jesus says, I want to bring you back to the heart of God. I want to bring you back to the center of God. And so he says, let's go right back to the very beginning. Let's talk about God's intent for man and woman. And he says, look, in the very beginning, it was one man, one woman for a lifetime. That was God's original intent. One man, one woman for a lifetime, in relationship together for as long as they live. That was God's intent for marriage. That's what God wanted to see. And they would be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. It is the closest of human relationships ever. There is no closer relationship than man and wife, because the two become one. In the act of sexual intercourse, two people become one flesh. Okay? So Jesus brings it back to the original. They're no longer two, but they're one flesh. God has joined them together. He says what God has joined together. Notice he says God. If you were to believe evolution, if evolution was correct, then it would not matter. Because it would just be an evolutionary process, that sexual intercourse would be an evolutionary process, and that's all it is. But the fact is, it's not. It's designed by God. We are created by God, and this act of sex is designed by God to make two people one. It's not a mistake, it's not an accident, it's not an evolutionary process. It's a God-ordained process. Because it's two people in relationship. It's in relationship. It's not about the legalities of what I could do and get away with. It's about a relationship of two people becoming one flesh. And he says, what God has joined together, let no one separate. The word joined here, by the way, is the word glued. What God has glued together, let no one separate. That's God's original intent, to glue two people together in a relationship. One man, one woman for their lifetime. That's the intent of marriage. The picture I have of glued is, I don't know if you've ever worked with plywood at all. Plywood is really pieces of wood glued together. If you take a look at a sheet of plywood and you look at the edge of the sheet of plywood, you'll see different layers. These different layers of wood are laminated or glued together. Have you ever tried to separate those layers of plywood? Have you ever tried to pull those layers apart where there's 4 or 5 or 6 layers? Ever tried that? You cannot pull them apart successfully. You can't pull them apart without splintering everything, without things cracking and splintering and breaking and maybe even getting slivers in your own self while you do it. It's impossible to do with plywood. Try it sometime. But that's the same kind of picture that's happening when two people become one flesh. And that's why divorce hurts so much. That's why divorce is so hard. It's because two people have become one. They become laminated together, and then they've decided to not be together, and they rip apart. And anytime you get divorced, there's a ripping apart of lives that happens. No matter how bad you dislike that person, there's still something that rips apart because God has glued people together. because that's his original intent for marriage. So God brings it back to marriage. God says, Jesus says, you guys want me to enter into a legal debate about what makes divorce right. And he says, it's not about what makes divorce right. It's about what makes marriage right. It's about going back to marriage. It's about a relationship. But the disciples aren't satisfied. The Pharisees aren't satisfied with that. The Pharisees want to push him more. The Pharisees want to say, no, give us a legal answer. And so they say, why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Now, they are referring to Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. Let me take you there to Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. Here we go. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 says this. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband, who divorced her, is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land of the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So, the Pharisees, they quote Deuteronomy 24:1. And they say, well, look, Moses commanded that we give her a certificate of divorce. But he didn't. They get it wrong. They quote it wrong. Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. He didn't command it. There was no command. There was never a command that says you must divorce your wife. There was no command from God that says you have to. What was happening in these times was that the Israelites had become hard-hearted toward God. And hard-hearted means you've closed your heart to a relationship with God, and it's all about you. Hard-heartedness doesn't look towards the things of God, it looks towards the things of self. Hard-heartedness says, it's me, it's me, it's me. Hard-heartedness closes God off, and anyone who wants to bring God into the picture. Hard-heartedness is just about me. The Pharisees were hard-hearted. There's all this healing going on, that Jesus is healing people and bringing them into the kingdom of heaven. And they're so hard-hearted they can't even acknowledge that Jesus is doing something good. They can't acknowledge God. They can only acknowledge themselves. And they say, well, Moses said to give a certificate of divorce. Jesus said he didn't command it. He gave it as a concession. He permitted it because the Israelites, they weren't taking marriage seriously. To them, it wasn't an important relationship. Sounds like today. Starter marriages we have today, right? Don't worry, just get married. In 5-6 years, you'll find the right person, and then you can get onto your real marriage kind of thing. So the Israelites were hard-hearted. They weren't listening to God and his original intent of marriage. And what would happen was any kind of, I'm displeased with you. I'm not satisfied with you. I'm not happy anymore. Get out, I divorce you. And so he would send her away. And then she would become somebody else's wife. And maybe that man was hard-hearted and got rid of her too. And all of a sudden, the original husband says, golly, life was actually a little bit better when she was with me than the one I'm with now. So I'm going to divorce this one and get her back. And what they were doing was they were just swapping wives all over the place. And they were trying to make it sound like it was legal. Well, I was displeased, so I sent her away. But let's try it again. No, how about that one? I saw someone in the marketplace. I think she would really make a great wife, but I'm married now. I'm displeased by you. I'm going to divorce you. And it was just this whole culture of sexual immorality happening because they were hard-hearted towards God, because they ignored God's original command of one man, one woman for a lifetime. And so they were degenerated into this sexual immorality, kind of like the culture we have today, where marriage didn't mean anything, where purity didn't mean anything. And so into this, Moses comes along. God says, look, this cannot happen. You cannot keep spiraling down into this degenerative character. If you are going to divorce your wife, if you've decided that you aren't going to stay in that relationship and my original intent is not good enough for you, okay, you're going to divorce her. You've decided that your heart is heart. I can't get through to you. But here's the deal. You cannot bring her back. So you better think hard. You better think long. You better put some work into this before you just flippantly say, I want to try that woman over there, so you're gone. So God was trying to bring some sort of design, some sort of order back into this chaos that had been happening in relationships, which ultimately happens today in relationships. There is chaos in today's culture in relationships. And so they want Jesus to give the legal ruling about how much chaos can we have. How far can we go before it's too far? What does God say is okay? I was speaking with someone recently and he asked me the question, is okay in God's vocabulary? Is okay in God's vocabulary? Think about that. Does God say, yeah, it's okay? There was a commercial, though, I don't know if you've seen it, and I can't remember all of it, but, they go into a restaurant and they're looking, well, how's this, how's that? Oh, it's okay. Well, how's your chef? Oh, he's okay. And then they went into another scenario, what's that? Oh, it's okay. And the point of the commercial was you don't want okay, you want perfection, you want the best, you want excellence, you just don't want okay. So is okay in God's vocabulary? Why do we want God to say, yeah, it's okay? It's not what I want for you. It's not that excellence that I desire for you. It's not that perfection I want for you. It's not my original design for you, but it's okay. It'll do. I can live with that. Isn't that what we're really trying to say? When we try to see how far away we can get from God and still be okay. What we're really saying is, I'm going to ignore what God's best is for me. What He wants what's best for me. He wants excellence for me. He wants perfection for me. But I'm okay with something else, and I'm hoping God is. That's what the Pharisees want Jesus to say. But He doesn't. He brings it back to relationship again. Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. Not because it was a command from God, not because it was hard-heartedness. Your refusal to follow God led to the fact that we need to bring some sort of order and design to this. But it was not that way from the beginning. Jesus goes back to Genesis. It wasn't that way from God's intent. It wasn't that way from God's design for relationships. And Jesus is trying to bring his disciples back into God's design for relationships. Because the kingdom of heaven is ultimately not like any other kingdom in this world. This world's kingdom looks to say what's okay. But God's kingdom says what's excellent. What's God's intent? What's his design? And he says in verse 9, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. So there you have that statement. That's the statement that sticks in everyone's head. That's the statement is why this title on your before chapter 19 says divorce. It should say marriage. Because Jesus continually brings it back to marriage. He says, look, I am not going to tell you that you can divorce your wife for this reason and that reason and this reason and that reason. I'm not getting into the legalities. Sexual immorality, he says that's one, except for sexual immorality. But anything else, no. Jesus is saying, look, divorce is sin. Just as adultery is sin, divorce is sin. Okay, that's what he's saying. But it's not about the divorce. It's about marriage. Please understand, it's about marriage. We get all tied up in legalities of it. We say, well, golly, I was a non-Christian before I was divorced, so that doesn't really count. I can't be accountable. Or it was mostly her fault or his fault. Or I just got the papers, I couldn't do anything about it. Or what about this case? What about... Jesus brings it back to relationship. It's always relationship. And he brings it back to God's intent. Now let me just say... No, let me carry on and then I'll just say. Because I want to show you the response of the disciples. And that will set us up for the next. The disciples said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it is better not to marry. They're like blown away. Are you kidding me? And everybody wanted to follow the school of Hillel. Today, if you were given the choice, the school of Shammai, divorce only for the reason of sexual immorality, or Hillel, divorce for if you're not happy, it's just not working out, whatever, which one are you going to pick? The school of Hillel, which everybody does. And so the disciples of Jesus were living under the school of Hillel, and their mind said, well, divorce is okay. It's nothing wrong with that. It's acceptable. It's fine. Everybody does it. It's kind of expected. But Jesus says, no. You need to look to the importance of marriage. The relationship of marriage is much more important than you guys are making it. And the disciples said, holy cow. Man, if you're saying, Jesus, that if I enter into a relationship with a woman and we become one flesh, and you're saying there's no legal right to get out of that except for her sexual immorality or his sexual immorality, I've got to stay with her? I've got to make that marriage important. I've got to make that relationship important. It would be better if I don't, because they recognize it's hard. It takes work. It takes relationship. It takes commitment. It takes a relationship with God to live in relationship with another for a lifetime. And that's Jesus' point. What God has put together. So the reality is we cannot stay in a relationship, in a marriage relationship. Two cannot be one for a lifetime without God. Without a relationship with God, which helps the relationship with the other. I mean, this is radical stuff. This is countercultural stuff. Marriage is the design of God that can only be entered into by the guidance of God, that can only be successful by the power of God. Jesus wants people to understand the importance of marriage and to think seriously before being married. Because if we enter into a marriage without God, knowing it's His design, and without the guidance of God, and without the power of God, there is no real hope in that marriage to last. It's about a relationship with God to get in a relationship with others. And the disciples are blown away by that. And they say, man, I think it'd be better not to marry. Because that's a pretty high standard. Like that's, Jesus. I can imagine going, whoa, what? Why didn't you tell me that before I started following you for 2.5 years? And Jesus replies, not everyone can accept this word, but only to those whom it has been given. In other words, not everybody's going to be saying, okay, God, I can do that. For there are eunuchs who are born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. There were eunuchs in those days. Some were born eunuchs. They had no desire for sex. They couldn't have sex. They just weren't able to. There were those who were made eunuchs, so they wouldn't have sex. And then there were some who chose not to have sex, to be celibate, perhaps like the Apostle Paul. And God says, for those people, they can that doesn't really apply to them because they're not looking to get married. They're not looking to be in a one flesh union. And there are those who become eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. They didn't become eunuchs just because they felt like it, because I'm tired of this, but because they wanted to serve God. And so they were celibate. And Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians 7, which we don't have time for today. But Paul talks about 1 Corinthians 7 to give yourself fully to God, because marriage divides your attention between God and your wife. And if you have a wife, you seek to please your wife and God, and sometimes those two are in opposition, and that causes trouble. So Paul says, in my opinion, it's better not to be married. And Jesus says, the one who can accept this should accept it. That marriage is by the design of God, by the guidance of God, and through the power of God. And this is tough stuff. This is tough because you've heard me say that God says, Jesus says and indicates that divorce is a sin. And it is. But here's what I want to tell you. Christ died for that sin. You're forgiven when you ask for forgiveness. Divorce is not an unforgivable sin. Divorce is not a sin that makes you a less of a Christian, less of a disciple of Christ than those who haven't been divorced. It just doesn't. The church in the past has beat people up because of divorce. My sincere apologies if you have been beat up by a pastor, by a church leader over your divorce, because you shouldn't have been. Because what has happened is the church made it about the legalities rather than about relationship. And they've stressed the legalities of what they think was this and that. Well, you should have tried harder. Well, this was your fault. Well, they made it about the legalities and not about a relationship. Isn't it interesting how we debate this crazy, what does it mean to be divorced and what grounds can we be, we debate that. We don't put that much effort into debating any other sin. We don't debate lying or cheating or stealing or slander or gossip or murder. We don't debate that. Well, I didn't technically murder him. It was kind of, we don't debate that. Why are we debating divorce like that in legal terms? Because we want to somehow be right before God legally. Can I tell you something? We can never be right before God on legal grounds. We can't. It's not the law that brings us salvation. It's not the law that brings us forgiveness. It's a relationship with Jesus that brings us forgiveness. So yes, if you're divorced, it's a relationship in Jesus that brings forgiveness of that. You don't have to go through well, technically it was this and I had no choice. And we're saved through faith, by grace. Not by the law, not by legal stuff. Let me give you an illustration, a story about how crazy we get as churches, as other disciples of Christ when it comes to divorce. And by the way, remarriage is not an issue. A woman in those days had to get remarried. It was assumed you would get remarried because a woman could not live on her own in that culture. So if her husband, for whatever reason, said, I'm divorcing you, she had no other choice. She had to go and find another husband. So remarriage isn't the sin. Remarriage isn't this big thing. Oh man, once you're divorced, you can never be remarried, because that's not it. That was assumed. In fact, in Matthew 5:31-32, he says if the husband divorces his wife, he causes her to be an adulteress. Why does he cause her to? Because she has no other choice. She's got to get married. So it's not about that. But let me tell you the story. I was in Bible college. And in Bible college, there were two men there that were divorced. No, actually, one was divorced, one wasn't. I better get the story straight. They were probably in their 30s. And One was divorced. One day his wife came to him and said, I no longer want to be with you. Here are the divorce papers. Just sign them. He tried to argue a little bit and say, no, I don't want, but in the end he signed the papers. Well, he signed the papers, graduated from Bible college, and wanted to become a pastor. The denomination that he wanted to become a pastor in said, no, sorry, you can't be a pastor because you're divorced. Sorry about that. There was another guy in Bible college. He wasn't divorced, but he had just gotten out of prison. He'd gotten out of prison because he tried to have his wife killed. He was in prison for conspiracy for murder. And so he served his time for conspiracy for murder. And he got out of prison. He finished Bible college. And the same denomination that said, no, you can't be a pastor because you're divorced, said, sure, you can be a pastor. Murder's fine. You can be forgiven of murder. You're okay. Since you're not divorced, you're good. And they said, since your wife is since remarried, therefore she's the one who committed adultery, so you're okay. What do you mean you're okay? He's in jail because he tried to have his wife murdered. And that's somehow better than someone who's divorced? Where do we start debating the legalities of what sin is worse than another sin? You see, that's where we go wrong. It's not about the legalities. It's about a relationship with Jesus. It's about a relationship with God. Jesus is saying, look, it's not about the legalities of divorce. It's about the relationship of marriage. Think soberly, think long, take it seriously, take marriage seriously, because God's intent is for one man, one woman, for a lifetime. That's the closest of relationships where two become one. Let's stop debating the legalities of divorce and what makes it right and what makes it wrong and when can I and can't I. It's about a relationship with Jesus. If you've been divorced and you've asked forgiveness for Jesus, you're forgiven. Just let it go. Don't go back there. Don't let anybody tell you you are worse than anybody else or a second-class Christian. Ignore it. Okay? It's not about the legality of it. It's a relationship with Jesus. And you are fine in this church because you're forgiven. And one sin is no greater than another. It's about relationship. That's what Jesus is saying. So let's stop trying to justify ourselves through legal terms and legal means. I'm sorry if you're divorced. I know that hurt. It has to have, because it rips two people apart. But you're forgiven. And God is the one who puts you back together. God is the one who restores you. God is the one who renews you in a relationship. It'll never be by you trying to justify what happened. It's okay. It's sin. Christ paid for the penalty of that sin, and you're forgiven. In my discussions with people, in my counseling with people, ultimately it comes down to, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. There's this whole debate about divorce and remarriage, and I don't know. I leave that up to the sovereignty of God. But I do know that Jesus died on the cross to pay for sins. And that's a sin he paid for. So let's bring it back to Jesus. Let's make it about Jesus and find healing and find peace and find rest and find wholeness in Jesus. And if you're married, make it about your relationship with God and your relationship with your spouse. Look to that relationship because it's about him. Thank you for joining us this morning. I know this really has been a hard topic. It may bring back some painful memories for you, some painful experiences. And it may cause a whole host of questions, as it usually does. But in Jesus is where we find our forgiveness. In Jesus is where we find our healing. In Jesus is where we find our wholeness. There's so much more that can be said. There's other scriptures that talk about this, and maybe if we're in some sort of forum, we could talk about it a little bit more. But ultimately, it would all come down to the fact that Jesus loves us, and he loves you, and there is no sin that separates you from him, because he died for them all. So go knowing that you're his child, and you're not a second-class one if you're divorced. He paid for that sin. It's okay. And maybe it wasn't sin. And I say that because, except for sexual immorality, and Paul indicates that if someone leaves, then they leave if they're an unbeliever. But there I get into the legal stuff. Gracious. See why this topic is so hard? Because we want to do more than we ought to. It's just about Jesus. So thank you. Go in the grace of Jesus. Experience his peace and his rest. Don't let anyone look down on you. Don't let anyone call you anything other than his favorite child of God. Because you are special to him. You're important to him. You're worth it to him. So enjoy his company. Enjoy his presence. Get to know him more. Amen.